China spent years making America as dependent as possible on it. So when China pulls out, it could cripple America. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. China has got the U.S. right where it wants it. And that's why the CCP is doing everything in its power to make the idea of decoupling toxic. State media says decoupling would be dangerous and irresponsible. Decoupling is just meant to contain China, and that it shows the West has a Cold War mentality. Right, why would we want to decouple from a country that covered up COVID and used the time to hoard medical supplies? I mean, think of all the things China has done for us. They send us fun balloons. Well, don't worry, our fearless political leadership is taking a hard line.
But we're not looking to decouple from China.
As I've said, the United States will assert ourselves when our vital interests are at stake, but we do not seek to decouple our economy from China's.
And the rest of the world is echoing America's rallying cry.
Decoupling is clearly not viable, desirable, or even practical for Europe.
Now, how could you decouple without killing the European economy?
This is all about de-risking, not decoupling.
Okay, so we won't decouple from China, we'll de-risk from China. I'm sure there's a very meaningful difference there. In fact, world leaders at this year's G7 summit all agreed to de-risk their economies from China. The US likes to call the strategy a small yard and high fence, basically protecting certain key parts of the economy without a broad-scale decoupling.
The United States should continue on its course of a small yard, high fence set of technology restrictions focused narrowly on national security concerns, not on the broader question of commercial decoupling.
And if anyone knows about small yards, it's Joe Biden. Here's his home in Delaware. I wonder why he doesn't want to decouple from China. But China doesn't want de-risking either. China says de-risking is just another term for decoupling, and that it's still all about containing China and its military. Well, I don't think China has too much to worry about. It seems business communities in democratic countries are often big political donors, and if they still have a lot of business in China, they're going to put full pressure on their leaders to keep trade open with China. But that doesn't mean decoupling isn't happening. It's just not for the reason you'd think or want. I'll tell you why in a moment, but first, when it comes to China news, you want to make sure you're getting all the news from multiple perspectives. For example, if you read State-Run China Daily, they'll tell you that China definitely retains its appeal for foreign firms. In fact, foreign firms are rosy on the Chinese market, according to experts. It might be obvious when Chinese state media is giving you a biased perspective, but it's not always so obvious with Western media, which is why I use ground news to see how topics are being covered by sources around the world, sources that may have conflicting motives. For example, in China news this past week, US senators grilled TikTok about its ties to the Chinese company ByteDance, which has close affiliations with the Chinese Communist Party. But as you can see, that's being covered mainly by the right and very little by the left, making this story a blind spot if you don't get your information from these sources. And if you scroll down, you can see all the different coverage, how factual each publication's reporting practices are, and even who owns each publication. First Post News, a privately owned mixed factuality source, reports US to investigate TikTok, while media conglomerate Nikkei, a highly factual source from Japan, uses slightly different wording, saying senators probe TikTok staff. That paints a slightly different picture. Ground News is on a mission to hold the media accountable and provide context so we can see how media narratives can easily shape public opinion. It's a great place to go if you want to be more informed than the average newsreader and find multiple perspectives that you might otherwise have missed. And it's also just really interesting to see all the hidden biases in the media. And that's why we're working with Ground News to sponsor this video, because we believe what they're doing is really important. So sign up at ground.news/China or subscribe through my link now and get 30% off the Vantage level subscription for unlimited access. The link is in the description. Now, As I was saying, decoupling is happening, but it's not the US taking a stand against, a regime that uses rape as a form of torture. No, China is decoupling from us because the CCP knows that since the US is so dependent on China, if they control the decoupling, they can weaponize it. Part of it is China trying to insulate itself against Western sanctions. The US and Europe have warned China that if it gives aid to Russia for its war in Ukraine, it could face similar sanctions as the one Russia is under. Of course, China has been giving aid, and the US obviously hasn't done anything. We're giving money to Ukraine, and we're giving money to China to give to Russia to use against Ukraine. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? But possibly if China invades Taiwan, like it has threatened to do many times, China will actually get sanctioned. That's why even before the war in Ukraine, China was trying to wean its economy off America. In 2015, China unveiled a plan called Made in China 2025. The plan involves replacing China's reliance on foreign technology imports with its own innovations and creating Chinese companies that can compete both domestically and globally. Basically, China wants the raw materials, the core components, and the finished product to all be made in China as much as possible. And they're getting all that tech and innovation by stealing it from Western companies. I mean, they're the Chinese Communist Party after all. This obviously has knock-on benefits for its military. The more advanced its technology, the more of an edge its military has. And speaking of war, China is also preparing for food shortages. One of the focuses of the Made in China 2025 initiative was farming machinery. For various reasons, China is not very efficient at producing food, so it has to rely on imports. The US-China trade war and the war in Ukraine exposed just how vulnerable China was to food supply issues. China only produces about 18% of its own soybeans, which is a main ingredient in animal feed. And as China's people consume more meat, demand for soybeans has gone up too. Last year, it got about 32% of its soybeans from the US, China's stated enemy. It's trying to grow more of its own soybeans, but it hasn't made much progress. So in the meantime, it's sourcing from more friendlier countries like Brazil. It's also trying to reduce and replace soybeans in animal feed. The obvious solution, China, is just go vegan. China also wants to beat the US dollar. One of the ways the US and its allies pushed Russian banks was to kick some of them out of the SWIFT banking system, which is a messaging service that allows for communication between banks. So China started its own banking system. In 2015, China's central bank launched the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS. Initially developed to promote yuan internationalization, the Shanghai-based CIPS is increasingly seen as China's alternative to the SWIFT global banking system, even before some Russian banks were kicked off. Right now, it's still limited by the number of financial institutions that are connected to it. But in theory, if China could grow the number of banks in its system, it could be a more limited alternative to the SWIFT system. China's also been trying to work with other countries to make the yuan more widely accepted. So far, it's gotten some countries like Russia, Argentina, Brazil, and Iraq to agree to do business in yuan. And according to Nikkei Asia, the yuan exceeded the dollar for the first time in bilateral trade between April and June. That said, it's still just a fraction of the transactions that happen in dollars. But just because it's a small percentage now doesn't mean it will be forever. China's been pushing other countries to accept the yuan because, again, it knows that it's much easier to blunt any Western sanctions if it doesn't have to use dollars. And for the same reason, China has been trying to wall itself off from Western tech. The Wall Street Journal reported last month that China was banning iPhone use for government officials at work. According to the Journal, the directive is the latest step in Beijing's campaign to cut reliance on foreign technology and enhance cybersecurity, and comes as China seeks to limit flows of sensitive information outside of China's borders. Now, this information came from anonymous sources and wasn't an official ban, but if China goes to war, it could become one. Already, Bloomberg is reporting that China might broaden that ban to include state firms and agencies. And with Chinese company Huawei this year coming out with its own smartphone, It's not hard to imagine the government using a carrot and stick approach to help its own companies. We're starting to see that already with Teslas. Elon Musk's electric cars are being banned from places like the World University Games, the resort town of Beidaihe, where Chinese leadership meet every summer, and an airport in central China. This was supposedly over security concerns about the cameras in the car and where their data was being stored. But I'm sure the Chinese government didn't mind that it was hurting a foreign company that is a direct rival to a lot of Chinese companies. It's almost like we should be decoupling from China. No, that's a crazy Cold War mentality. Here's a lesson in Communism 101. If they accuse you of doing something, it means they've been doing that to you for years already. And as I mentioned, this episode is sponsored by Ground News. It's a great tool to help you stay well informed about what's happening in the world and how it's being covered by all sides of the political spectrum. Check it out at ground.news/China or click the link below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.